Hello readers, I'm Amy and I'm your nonfiction feminist. Today I'm going to be talking about my October wrap-up. I'm also going to start adding or trying to add a couple of TBR books to the end of my wrap-up videos. I am very much a mood reader, but I am trying to get a couple of books scheduled for each of the months. So just a heads up there. Let's get into this because I have had a very huge month. I barely remember reading half of these books, even though it's been a really great month because I've just gone through so many books lately. So let's get started. I started off October, I started reading this in September because I was super excited to get started on my October TBR. I started and finished Northanger Abbey. I did start this earlier this year and I wasn't able to finish it at that time, but I started and finished it now. I did really enjoy this. It took me a minute to get back into Jane Austen's writing style. I do really love Jane Austen. She's a very popular author, but she can be a little bit tricky to acclimate to. She's one of the slightly more difficult classic authors. Not that she's hard to read, she's just a little harder than some other classics. Northanger Abbey is a satire book about a girl who is obsessed with Gothic novels and sees all these Gothic elements in her life that aren't really there. She's just really obsessed with Gothic novels. She is obsessed with one Gothic book in particular. For the life of me, I cannot remember which book it was, but I've actually been seeing it from a couple of booktubers this month, so if I can find it, I will put the name of it right here. Anyways, I do feel that the title, Northanger Abbey, is a little bit misleading. So the idea of this book is that she goes to Northanger Abbey, and because of all the Gothic reading that she's doing, she's seeing all these secrets and lies that aren't really there, and it affects her. You don't actually get to see Northanger Abbey until you're well over halfway through this book. So most of this is actually she is getting her first chance to go out into the world and into society. So she goes with an aunt and uncle to Bath, I believe, where she's exploring the city and she's going to these dances. She meets a guy that she's really into. She makes some friends who turn out to not really be her friends. And Northanger Abbey itself is maybe a sixth of this book. So it's not really even in here that much. The Gothic elements are in here a lot, where she's just seeing people being secretive, seeing people lying, just all of this stuff. But all of that said, I did really, really enjoy this. I just think that you should tailor your expectations a little bit because the synopsis for this book is not super accurate. But I enjoyed it. It's another classic Jane Austen. Then I read an arc. I believe it is out now because I don't remember the exact publication date, but I do think it's been published or it's going to be published very, very soon. That is Kam Girl by Issa Mazzy, I believe is how you say it. This book is about a woman who really got into camming at a certain point of her life and was building her online community and some of the problems that she dealt with in that and how it was kind of a reflection on where she was with her mental health at the time. I loved this book. I'm very into books that look at the sex industry, and this is a memoir on camming, which is part of the sex industry, so I was hoping to really like it. I did really like it. I will say at first, when I was getting halfway through the book, I was really enjoying it, but I wasn't entirely sure where she was going with all of this. Wow, these stories are really interesting. I love reading about this, but how is she going to wrap this all up? Because I find that a very good memoir tends to have an overall kind of life lesson or message included in it, and she did end up having that, which I really enjoyed. It was all kind of a conversation on mental health. But besides that aspect, something else that I just really loved about this book is I did find myself connecting with it a lot. I myself have not done camming, but it just really kind of reflected on the online society in general. Yes, this book is particular to being a cam girl and dealing with people who watch cam girls and interact with them and kind of feel like they own them since they are paying them for their services. But in watching her interaction with these different people online and how she tries to meet up with some of them in real life, I really, as a booktuber, as a YouTuber, I kind of related to this in that you see all these big booktubers who I'm sure kind of feel harassed by maybe some of their subscribers who feel that they get to have a piece of that person, like they own a piece of that person because they're contributing to Patreon or something. How you do build a community with your subscribers and how some of those subscribers may defend you from other trolls or commenters who aren't being so nice. It just... Watching her interactions with the people who watched her camming just really felt familiar and kind of like a commentary on the online community in general and how people interact with those who are online. So I did get a lot more out of this than just she's a cam girl. This is all to say I really, really loved this memoir. I think it's really good. There are some pretty descriptive sexual parts to this book, so if you're not into that, I probably wouldn't recommend it because it does get a little bit graphic. But it's great. If you're looking for a memoir on the sex industry, highly, highly recommend. The writing is very good. The stories are engrossing. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Next up, I got to read my second Caitlin Doughty book. The first one that I read of hers was Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which is a memoir on whenever she was working in a funeral home, specifically kind of discussing the crematorium part of it. From Here to Eternity is where Caitlin Doughty is kind of traveling around the world and she's looking at different countries and different cultures and how they handled death. While I enjoyed this book, I definitely liked Smoke Gets in Your Eyes more. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes was, again, it was a memoir, which I really love memoirs. I've been reading a lot of them this year. But it was also very humorous. You could really feel Caitlin Doughty's voice. And in From Here to Eternity, I felt like I was missing a lot of that voice. It was a lot more of a dry nonfiction. Not to say that it was dry, but it was much drier than her memoir. And while it was really interesting to read all of these tidbits on death around the world, and I did get some kind of inspiration for things that I would like to happen when I myself die, this isn't my favorite book of the two of hers that I read. I am hoping in the next year or so that I can hopefully get my hands on Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, which is her third book about questions that kids ask about death. I think that sounds super awesome. But even though this was not my favorite of hers, it's still very interesting, and I do recommend it if you want to learn more about various death rituals. Also, this cover. I mean, come on. Next up was a library book, which actually reminds me, something else that I should discuss. The Goodreads, or one of the Goodreads groups that I am involved in is Devour Your TBR, which is a challenge for the whole year of 2019 where each month has a different challenge. October was called Owntober. It is focusing on books that you own. Most of the books that I read this month I did own, so I did really, really well with that. But anyways, library book that I read this month, that is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I have never read this book before, which really surprises me. I feel like I should have read this. It's kind of it's a very classic coming of age kind of young sexual journey sort of a book. I did listen to this as an audiobook. I adored it. It's definitely not in my age group or not in the general style of book that I would usually read, not style of book. I tend to stick with more adult books than anything else. This is definitely a middle grade book, But that said, I really, really loved it. This is another classic Judy Blume book, and you are following Margaret as she prepares for puberty. She is young. A lot of her friends are starting their periods or supposedly starting their periods. She has not started her period yet. She has not grown a chest yet. She really wants that to happen. They're making lists of boys that they have a crush on. And another element to this that I didn't think I would like, but that I ended up really loving, was a discussion of religion. I myself grew up religious. I am not currently religious for many, many reasons. But in this book, Margaret, one of her parents is Jewish. I believe her other parent was Catholic. And each of her grandparents really want her to be in their particular religion, have their particular religious views, while her parents are like, no, you're going to wait until you grow up and then you can make those decisions. We want you to kind of explore religion and see what your options are before you make a choice. And Margaret gets really confused about that, because she's like, oh, this element looks interesting, this element looks interesting. She actually goes to the Jewish church, whatever that's called. I'm not very knowledgeable on this stuff. And she finds it really, really boring, which I totally relate to, because church was so boring when I was a kid. Like, so unbelievably boring. I didn't think I would like that part of this, but I really loved it, because it's really questioning the different things that you learn about religion, and it's having a discussion of how early should we learn religion. She is really upset that she doesn't have a religion because she feels that she should. A lot of that is because she wants to fit in with particular groups of her friends or relate to her friends in certain ways that she can't because she didn't grow up with a particular religious affiliation. So there's just a huge discussion on that, and I loved it. It is more than just a discussion of puberty. But I highly adore this book. If you want a nice middle grade coming of age for your kid to read and start having a discussion on these issues, would totally recommend this. Next book was Beloved, which I no longer have the physical copy because I did give that away. Beloved is by Toni Morrison, who died earlier this year. She's a very famous Black author, and I first read her when I read Bluest Eye, which I really enjoyed. It's a very short book. Then I read Tar Baby, which I did not understand at all what that book was about or what was going on. And I got maybe a third of the way through Beloved before I then got on SparkNotes and combed through the synopsis and the analysis of the different chapters as I kind of skimmed through the rest of the book trying to understand what was going on. Ultimately, I really loved the message that Toni Morrison was giving us in Beloved. I think that her writing was very beautiful. However, I did give up Beloved and most of my Toni Morrison collection to a friend who really enjoys her and is trying to build up her bookshelves, because ultimately I didn't enjoy reading this book. The message was awesome. It's just discussing Black struggles in slavery and in contemporary times, contemporary being like just after slavery was abolished, I think. Don't really remember a lot about the book. So the message was awesome. The writing was gorgeous. But ultimately, I would classify Toni Morrison as a literary fiction writer. And literary fiction, I have read some literary fiction books that I have really loved, but ultimately it tends to be a very difficult genre for me as far as readability. And for my taste, this book just didn't have that readability. I really struggled in reading it to comprehend anything that was going on, to understand any of the symbolism that she was using. So in reading about this book, it's awesome. In personally reading this book, not for me. But what are you going to do? I did pass it on to someone who will better appreciate Toni Morrison's writing. I do still have Bluest Eye. I'm holding on to that book. I also have Sula, which I've heard a lot of people recommending, so I'm going to give her one more try. If I don't like it, that's just going to be it for Toni Morrison for me, but that's fine. Next up. I was supposed to do a series review for these books, and I kept putting it off and not doing it. For one thing, I did not finish the series, so I didn't think that everyone would really appreciate me giving a dedicated review for them. Also, I ended up hating it. So, I was not in the mood to film a single review for these. So, that series is Koji Suzuki's Ring. Ring is the book that started the horror movie series Ring. I have not seen those movies. I'm not going to see those movies. I saw like the first 5 minutes of one and it completely freaked me out and was completely unrelated to the book. Not completely, but mostly unrelated to the book. This book is one of my husband's books. He got it whenever he was studying Japanese in college. That's studying the culture and the history and the language and all of that. And this was one of the books that he was assigned to read. I read it after him, and I really enjoyed it. Also, again, cover. It's so cool. Also, sorry if you've been getting that washing machine in the background. I forgot to close the door. This book is about these people who mysteriously die, and the reporter who is chasing after the story of their deaths and trying to find out why they all kind of died at the same time, how their deaths are connected, and I would classify this series as, like, sci-fi paranormal mystery kind of a thing. I did really enjoy this first book. I do think it had its problems, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. Then I started and finished the sequel, which is Spiral, also with a super cool cover. And I started Loop, which is the third book, and by this time I just want to ram my head into the wall, because Koji Suzuki, why? Why do you do this? So, to give you an accurate idea of these books, I do feel that I need to give a small villain spoiler. It's not going to ruin the book series for you, but I feel that it's necessary. I will wait a second. You can come back whenever I put this book down. So the villain in this book, I guess you would call them, ends up being intersex, female identifying, because that's how she was raised. And this series in general does not do a good job of discussing that. There are some kind of gender problems in this where they're like, she's not really a female, sort of a thing, which is annoying. And the main problem that I had with this particular one is just making the intersex person the villain, which I feel like a lot of people who are differently gendered or who have disabilities, it's kind of a trope in its own way to have a lot of these people end up being the villains. I'm going to keep this book up because I have another spoiler for you for the second book, which again I feel is super important to deciding whether or not you want to read these. And in Spiral, one of the kind of bigger plot points with that is that as an intersex person, she is able to self-reproduce. And I kind of get that as a paranormal horror element. It does contribute a lot to the plot of the story. But I also feel like that's just not the way to go. That's giving the wrong idea of what an intersex person is. I feel like if everyone was far more educated on intersex people and their bodies, then it wouldn't be such a problem. But I personally know of people who think that intersex isn't even an actual thing, that these people don't exist. They do exist, and self-reproduction is not a thing in the human population. There are some animals that can self-reproduce. Humans are not one of them. That's a problem. Okay. Everyone can come back. Finished up the major spoilers. My other problem with this series is just the general sexism. The first book, you have the wife and child of one of the main characters, and the wife is really surprised when the main character starts being concerned about his young daughter and actually spending time with her, which, like, okay, it's not the woman's job to do all of the childcare. Like, whatever. Maybe it's a product of the times. It's the early 2000s. And then in the second book, again, minor spoiler, this is like at the beginning of the book, so it's not really a spoiler. But book 2, the girl walks into the coroner's office. The coroner is the main character in book 2, and he can tell by how dizzy she is and by the smell in the room that she is on her period. No. Unless you have horrible, horrible hygiene, you cannot smell the period in the room. That's not how the body works. No. Like, no. And then eventually in the book, you kind of get this creepy stalker vibe going on, where someone walks into this girl's house, picks up some underwear that she left on the chair, and smells it. That ended up going nowhere and contributing to the plot. Not at all. Smelling the period itself did contribute to the book, but there are so many other ways that he could have done that. And then in the beginning of the third book, there was a really creepy thing with a father and son that I just don't want to talk about. And at that point, I'm like, no, I'm not reading these anymore. This is creepy. Koji Suzuki is horribly sexist. And it didn't feel like so much of a here's the way I think about this world, deal with it thing, as it did an uninformed thing. So hopefully since the early 2000s, Koji Suzuki has become a better informed person. Koji Suzuki needs to do a hell of a lot better. I will be donating these 2 books. I'm probably going to keep this one because the other thing with this series is that each of the books, while they do play into each other, they are each standalones. So there's that. But yeah. Goodbye. What else did I read that was better? Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I got this as an audiobook from the library. I really enjoyed it. It's a very hard sci-fi that I don't even know how to explain this book. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it if you want a hard sci-fi or just to kind of up your sci-fi game. But I feel like talking about any part of this book would just kind of majorly spoil it. Basically, this guy could have been a very world-renowned scientist and instead has settled down into family life, and then he gets kidnapped and wakes up and his life is completely different. The beginning kind of had It's a Wonderful Life vibes, sort of, but ends up being a sci-fi. I don't know. I recommend it. It's good. BookTube has been excited about this book for a reason. The Antidote for Everything by Kimmery Martin. This was another arc for me. I got all of my arcs that I've been discussing from NetGalley. Oh, except for Kam Girl. Kam Girl, I think, was from Edelweiss, or Above the Tree Line, or whatever they're calling themselves now. The Antidote for Everything is basically about a hospital that is weeding out all of its LGBTQ plus patients, and it's specifically centering on 2 of the doctors from that hospital. And I don't know, I was really middle of the road on this book. I think the characters were really interesting. I'm not a huge romance person, and there was a romance in this book that I feel would have been better off if it had been established before the story started. And in general, I felt like this book was just trying to do too much at once. It had the romance, it talked about drug stuff, it had a mystery, it had the hospital problems. I liked the points it was trying to make, but I felt like it was trying to do way too many things at once. That said, while this was very much a middle-of-the-road book for me, I do think that most people will probably enjoy it. It does have very good reviews on Goodreads from the people who've read the arc so far. This book just wasn't for me. But I do think a ton of people will really love this. I just didn't like how much it had going on, and I skimmed through a lot of this. I'm losing track of everything. Here. The last book that I finished this month was A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman. This is the same author who did Bird Box. I have not read Bird Box yet, but now I am super excited to read it because I loved this book. This is a horror novella talking about a house at the bottom of a lake. I don't know how much of this people have really discussed on BookTube. Like, I see it mentioned a lot. I feel like they don't really talk much about the plot of it. Basically, this horror was kind of an explanation of horror stories as a metaphor, because this book did end up being a metaphor for things, and I feel like that's all I can really tell you. But I loved it. It starts off with two people who are going to go on a date. They're going to go canoeing around these lakes, and then they find a house at the bottom of a lake. And while I am not a romance person, I really loved the romance. It didn't feel super tropey. You just had these two people who were really awkward and cute together, and it felt kind of like the beginning of my own relationship did, because I am a horribly awkward person, especially when it comes to dating. I'm just an awkward person in general, and I really connected with the super awkward romance of the main characters in this book. And if you want a short horror book that is thrilling but not necessarily scary, like, I would totally recommend this novella. I actually really just started getting into novellas this year, and I'm loving it and would like to read more novellas. So if you have some novella recommendations, please leave them down below. I will put them on my list and read them eventually, because I'm loving this. So those are my books for this month. I can also link my October TBR up in the cards. I started almost every single one of those books. Just a lot of them I ended up DNFing. So here you go. This is a decent October TBR. I feel very impressed with the amount of books that I read this month. And, oh, also, I was going to do a short TBR for November, so you have an idea of what I'm reading, because I don't usually do much for TBRs unless they're for readathons. Because I am more of a mood reader, but I want to try incorporating TBRs in my channel more, but there's just no reason that I can see for me to give them their own video, so just popping them at the end of the wrap-up. I have I Am Malala, Yes Please, and The Glass Castle. Will link my nonfiction November try a chapter tag up in the corner. These are the 3 books that I ultimately ended up choosing. And I also got 3 Women from Book Depository, #not sponsored, but I should be. I'm going to try and read this in November as well. And I have such a short TBR because there is one huge fiction book that I am hoping to focus on. I don't know if I'll finish it this month. I probably will. I'm also buddy reading it with someone, and I want it to be a surprise because I'm really excited for this, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I am also hoping to have a dedicated vlog for it. Also, I totally forgot to mention the book that is sitting right in front of me, Well of Ascension, book 2 of the Mistborn series. I read about half of it in the last couple of days at the end of October. I will hopefully be finishing it this month. And yeah, really loving it. More political than the first book. It's a fantasy. There's a lot of argument as to whether or not it is young adult. It wasn't initially created as a young adult. That said, I think it is accessible to just about everyone. Really loving it. But there you go. There's my wrap-up / TBR / whatever. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, be my friend, ring the notification bell. I post every Sunday, Wednesday. I will see you in my next video. Have a lovely beginning of November. Bye, friends.